For you are strong when I am weak. Your garden keeps me safe.
I love this theme that we're in November called Heroes of the Faith. I think partly because I think every guy wants to be a hero. Every young guy obviously dreams of being a superhero or whatever it may be. But as we come into today, I get to speak on the amazing man of God that is Joseph. And Joseph reveals many things to us, but one of them is that he reveals that the way God cares for us can often be very confusing. I don't know if you've noticed this. God doesn't do things often the way we want him to do them. Sometimes our expectations and the reality of what's given to us, there's a bit of a gap in between. So I've called today's message, Perplexing Providence. That God does provide, make no doubt about that. But the way he goes about that, God didn't like that point. The way he goes about providing for us can sometimes be out of our mindset, that his ways are higher than our ways, that his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And so today we're going to look at the perplexing providences of God through the story of Joseph. And I love this hero theme. When I was growing up, my mum used to love this TV show called Lois and Clark. Anyone remember Lois and Clark? It was the adventures of Superman. It was like a romantic kind of one. Dean Cain played Superman. My mum would be very proud that I remember the name of that actor. And in one episode, I don't know how it came to be, but there was a good Superman and a bad Superman. I think they cloned him for some reason. You know, anything can happen in these. But there's a good Superman and a bad Superman, and they had the same abilities, they had the same powers. Good Superman would go save everyone regardless. Someone's falling from a building, he would save them. Bad Superman gets there and he says, yes, I'll save you if you pay me. And he starts to charge money to save people. And at the end of the day, they had the same potential, same ability, but the good Superman who would save everyone regardless, he was viewed as a hero. But bad Superman, who would say, yes, if you pay me, he was viewed as an extortionist. And as we go through the Bible, there is something common to all heroes, that it's about the yes that you say. That you can say yes to God, yes if, or you can be a yes even if. Those are the two types of heroes that we see in the Bible, that we see the rich young ruler come to God and say, yes, I'll follow you if I can keep my worldly comforts and my worldly riches. And God says, no, you can't. And then he says, well, I'm not following you. He was a yes if kind of guy. But then there's the yes even if type of person. It's the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that says, even if God doesn't rescue us from this furnace, I'm still going to follow you. And this is important because God uses and God sees his plans come to fruition through yes, even if people. Yes, if people, it gets hard, they cut and run. They can't see the immediate benefit for their life. And so following God doesn't seem to have any use to them anymore. So they cut and run. But Joseph is a yes, even if kind of guy. And you need to see which type of Superman you are. Are you the good Superman who says yes, even if? Or are you the bad Superman who says yes, if, on my terms, on my conditions? And this is really important because as we see in the story of Joseph, God's plans come to fruition between yes, even if people. If your obedience or your love is conditional, then you'll cut and run when things are bad. But we're going to see in this story that with God, silence is not absence. We're going to see that a lack of breakthrough doesn't mean a lack of approval in God's eyes. That hardship actually means God might be about to use you for greatness. And so it's important to be a yes, even if person. Because if you're a yes, if person, you'll never see those means come to an end. And Joseph was a yes, even person. Yes, even if person. And his life, as I was studying this, really clarified a few hard to answer questions for me. As I was reading this, it really brought to clarity some hard questions. I've got them on the slide here. Joseph's life. This is what it clarified for me. Can other people block God's purpose or dream for my life? Can what they do affect how God can use me? Should I pray for hard times to leave? Good question. Why do some people see breakthrough and others in similar circumstances don't? Hard to answer. Joseph's life clarifies also, does righteousness get rewarded? And what part of God's plan for my life depends on him, and what part of that rests with me? Some really hard to answer questions. But as we go through the story of Joseph, I pray that this message is one of hope, that you might be in some hard times. You might be identifying with Joseph either at the top of his hills or the bottom of his valleys, but this message is one of hope. And before I get into the nitty-gritty of it and the revelations that the word brings, I want to tell you about Joseph's life on the big picture. And I've got a slide which is going to show his timeline of his life. Maybe. There it is, Joseph's life. And we have the hills and the valleys and the timeline up to his 30 years, because that's what the Bible focuses on most. So when he was young, he's 15 years old, he got these dreams. It's about 15, it's before 17, it doesn't really say the exact age. And he gets two dreams, that these sheaths of grain are bowing down to him, that the moon and the stars and the sun are bowing down to him. And it's a reference that his family is going to bow down to him. His family obviously hate that because there is a progression in terms of who gets the inheritance of the father, and the father and mother holding positions of honor bowing down to him doesn't really sit well with them. And actually the brothers then, because of that, start to hate Joseph and they sell him into slavery. It seems a bit drastic. If you had a bad dream, I'm going to sell you into slavery. But that's what happened. And he was chucked in a pit, sold into slavery by his brothers. From there, the slave traders came and got him, and he was a slave in Potiphar's house. Potiphar was the guard, the captain of the Egyptian guard, and he had a big estate. And Joseph, because of his conduct, because of his character, rose to the top and ended up managing his whole estate. It says that nothing was out of his reach except for one thing, which was Potiphar's wife. So naturally, Potiphar's wife liked Joseph. And the Bible says in the CSB that he was well built and he was handsome. He probably did CrossFit, and Potiphar's wife wanted a piece. Joseph constantly said, no, stay away. I'm not keen. But time after time, she kept coming back. She was persistent. And one day she grabs his cloak and he legs it out of there, because you can't stand and try and resist sexual temptation. You got to run. And he leaves his coat there. He gets framed for sexual assault and put in prison. So he's going on this roller coaster of a life. And in prison, he's there. And because of his character again and his conduct, he rises to the top and he starts managing the whole prison. And this cupbearer for the king comes in there. He's a naughty cupbearer. I don't know what you do as a cupbearer to be naughty, but the king wasn't happy. Chucks him in prison. And Joseph interprets a dream for him that comes to pass, and the cupbearer gets released from prison. A while later, he gets forgotten, actually. So the cupbearer says, hey, I'll remember you, Joseph. Doesn't do that. Joseph stays in prison. And then Pharaoh has a dream about 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows, which represent 7 years of plentiful harvest and then 7 years of famine. That is going, and so Pharaoh has a dream. None of his magicians or anyone like that can interpret it for him. And then the cupbearer is like, oh, there's this dude I met in prison, like 2 years ago. He can do this for you. And so Joseph does that. He's a man of wisdom. He comes up with a plan, and Pharaoh says, all right, because of your wisdom and your plan and the Spirit of God is with you, you're going to be my 2IC of all Egypt. You're going to run, you're going to be oversight of the GNP of Egypt. You're going to make sure everything works well. And Joseph is elevated to his place of fulfilled potential. And he also saves millions of lives from starvation. It's a crazy story. And there's many parts in this story that you will probably identify with. Hopefully not being thrown in a pit and left for dead. But there's other parts of the story that you will definitely identify with. And so we start at the start. It's good to have a holistic approach, because some of the things in Joseph's life, you need a retrospective vision to see where it's heading. And so at 17 years of age, Joseph gets a dream. He gets 2 dreams. His brothers hate him for it. They're big dreams, because sometimes when you get a really big dream, or maybe you think different enough, or you think audacious enough, people who are insecure try and pull your dream down to their level. They try and even out the status quo, because haters think that pulling you down is going to lift them up. But that's not how it works in the kingdom of God. And Joseph, in his life, we see that he had this huge dream, that all his family were going to bow down to him. But I would love if Citipointe was never a community that tears other people down with big dreams because of our own personal insecurities. That we, in Australian culture, tall poppy syndrome is a real deal. That we see someone and be like, who do they think they are? Let's tear them down. Would we never be a community that tears down God's big dreams for people because of our personal insecurity? And these guys, instead of being ruled by him, they said, let's chuck him in a pit. So before they chuck him in a pit, Joseph's father says, hey, go check on my brothers. They're out in the field. They're taking care of the sheep. Joseph goes out there to the spot where they're supposed to be. They're not there. And so he finds this other guy there, and we pick up the story in Genesis 37, where he asked the man, I'm looking for my brothers. Joseph said, can you tell me where they're pasturing their flocks? They've moved on from here, the man said. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. Now, Dothan's an important place. Remember that name. So Joseph set out after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him in the distance, and before he had reached them, they plotted to kill him. They said to one another, oh, look, here comes that dream expert. So now, come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal ate him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. Judah said to his brothers, what do we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers agreed, because apparently selling him into slavery is much better than killing him. When Midianite traders passed on by his brothers, they pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph to Egypt. Such a big betrayal, that the people closest to you, instead of championing your dreams, actually want to do you harm. And they chucked Joseph in this pit. And we don't know exactly how long he was there for, but he sat there long enough for the slave traders to come along. And he couldn't get out of the pit, which means it's probably a deep pit. So they chuck him in there. He's probably injured. He's bruised. He's battered. He's feeling down on himself. But most of all, I think he's probably confused, because God gave him a word. God gave him a dream. He said, this is going to come to pass. And from a human perspective, he's been defeated. It looks like the sins of man have triumphed over the plans of God. But we've seen this before. We've seen it in Jesus, that when they buried him in the tomb, they thought that the plans of man had triumphed over the plans of God. But we know that Jesus rose again, because no one else's actions, not another person's actions, can inhibit the plan of God for your life. Because in our lives, we can feel like in our workplaces that someone does something and that stops us progressing, or someone says something and that cancels out our plans. But with God, and if we look at this moment in the grand scheme of Joseph's life, his brothers actually didn't stop the dreams of God. They actually set the dream in motion. That other people's actions, other people's sin cannot stop the plans and the dreams of God for your life. Because our God is so big, he uses the evil forces for his good. Our God is so strategic that the enemy's schemes actually fit into his plans. And if you read through the Old Testament, he uses enemy armies to bring about his will on the planet. That our God is not just the God of the good, our God is the God of everything. Everything works for God's sovereignty. Everything works for his good. But Joseph probably can't see that right now. He's in a pit. He's in a pit. He's in Dothan. And he's probably wondering, when's my breakthrough coming? God, you gave me a word. When is my relief coming? But God in this place seems silent. But even when God isn't speaking, he's still saying something a lot of the time. And Dothan is important because 2 centuries later, just a few centuries later, in 2 Kings chapter 6, another man of God's in Dothan. Elisha's there in Dothan with his servant. And just like Joseph's brothers were trying to do harm to him, an army of Aram was trying to do harm to Elisha. Similar circumstance, exact same place, same God. And Elisha's servant says to him, what are we going to do? Like, there's an army, there's chariots. They pulled out all the stops. There's chariots, there's horses, there's an army that's going to kill us. And Elisha says, Lord, let him see what I see. And there's this army of heaven around the army of earth. And God brings around a big victory on that day. Have you ever wondered why God moves for someone else, but he doesn't move for you? Same God, same place, same person trying to do harm to him, but seems like God is answering someone else's prayers, but he's not answering mine. Why does God work for Elisha? And why isn't he not working for Joseph? Because God's plans for your life are far greater than comfort and ease. Because God knows that Joseph is a yes, even if type of hero. And God knows and sees in retrospective that he has a purpose that's going to deliver a whole nation from slavery. And if he has someone righteous that can push through this hardship, that can be built up instead of tore down, then his purposes are going to be exacted on such a national level. But it seems like God is silent. And this is an article My lovely wife found it for me. It's from Dr. Brock Bastian. He's the head of the School of Psychology in Melbourne. Not a Christian, but a psychologist looking at the effects of adversity and suffering in human growth. And he says this: conditioning people to achieve success and happiness changes how people respond to their negative emotions and experiences, causing them to feel worse about their failures. Dr. Bastian concluded, historically, adversity is important. That's where we grow. In places of discomfort, Dr. Bastian says, we had this idea that if we could just provide our children and our society with more comfort, maybe we'd be happy, but this isn't true. Of course, being too uncomfortable isn't good either. We're not suggesting that the homeless or the chronically ill are to be envied, simply that there is value to be found in hardship. You can't feel challenged by something that is comfortable. And we see here that Joseph is starting to be shaped in his suffering. He's starting to be crafted in his challenge, because without the pit, there's no Potiphar. Without Potiphar's house, there's no prison. Without prison, there's no cupbearer. Without the cupbearer, there's no audience for Pharaoh. Without an audience with Pharaoh, there's no providence of God over the nation of Egypt. And if Joseph had such a narrow mindset, if he restricted it down to that one situation, this is uncomfortable, that would have ruined God's plan, ruined his life's purpose in that one moment. And Joseph was sold into Potiphar's household. Out of everywhere that he could have been sold into, he sold into the household of the captain of the guard of Egypt. That even in these seemingly unfortunate circumstances, God's definitely still on the move. He could have been sold anywhere, but he was sold in the captain of the guards, and his character and his conduct let him rise to the top of this place. And because of the wisdom that is in him from the Spirit of God, he's managing the whole household. As we said, there's nothing that's out of his reach except for one thing, which is Potiphar's wife. Now, because he's such a good-looking lad, he's probably going about his business, managing the household. He might be cleaning the pool one day, and Potiphar's wife's peeking through the curtains like, yep, I want a piece of that. And so she pursues him relentlessly, day after day, and Joseph eventually says, how can I do this immense evil? How can I sin against God? And she grabs his garment and he runs and leaves his garment there. If you have an over-eager suitor, I'm guessing if you call them an immense evil, it might get them to calm down just a little bit. But in Genesis 39, she's scorned, she's shamed because she's been rejected. And so Genesis 39 verse 16 says what she did. She said, she put Joseph's garment beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the same story. The Hebrew slave you brought us has came to make a fool of me, but when I screamed for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, these are the things your slave did to me. He was furious and had him thrown into prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was there in prison. Joseph acted morally. He did everything right. He acted holy. His deeds were holy. And what was his reward? Prison. He got blamed. He got framed for something he didn't even do. His name was defamed and he gets chucked in prison. And sometimes we can get in the same mindset of, God, I've done all these things for you. Is this what I get? Is this what I get for living a good Christian life? Is this my reward for this? Because the reward for righteousness is an instant earthly reward. Righteousness keeps you in the path of God, that you will get everything that you need to fulfill your purpose and God's plans. When it comes to the plans of God, we need to know what's in our hands and what's in God's. When it comes to the dream, because everyone in this place has a purpose, not like the person next to you, your purpose, individual purpose. And when it comes to your purpose, we need to know what we are responsible for and what God is responsible for. Proverbs 16 verse 9 says this, a person's heart plans his ways, but the Lord determines his steps. Our heart plans our way, God determines our steps. Hearts, us, steps, God. So if we apply this to Joseph, God is determining Joseph's steps. What? Are you saying that God is determining that Joseph was in a pit, that he was in Potiphar's house, that he went to prison? What kind of a loving God would want that for someone that he loves? The kind of loving God that doesn't want to see millions of people die from famine. And so we need someone of righteousness, someone of wisdom in Pharaoh's court to make those decisions. We can be so narrow-minded on our own lives that we lose scope of what God is trying to do. If we had a tape measure that was out here, I probably should have thought of this beforehand, and you marked your line. Actually, I'm going to pause this right there. It's 11 o'clock. This is Remembrance Day. It doesn't matter what we're doing at this time. I believe that we need to honor those people that have gone before, who believed in something, gave something, and built a future. So right now, we're just going to have a moment of silence in remembrance of all those people that gave their lives for us in the war. Aren't you grateful that people would give before us, that we can live in a country of freedom? Let's put our hands together for them. I know it's not enough for what they did, but let's give them honor. We remember them today. Without their hardship, we wouldn't be in the country that we were in. Now we get back to Joseph's hardship. What loving God would do that to Joseph and put him through all that, put him through the pits and the prisons. The loving God who wants to see millions of people not die from starvation. See, Joseph's responsibility is his heart. God's responsibility is his steps. Joseph's responsibility is his character and his conduct. God's responsibility is his elevation. It's Joseph's responsibility for his habits and his actions, but it's God's responsibility to see the dreams come true. John Maxwell says this quote, that many of us have upward dreams, but downward habits. That sometimes we take God's responsibility and try and make our dreams come to fruition, but the habits and the actions of our life aren't propelling us upwards. It's the minutes of every day, the moments of every day that actually are pushing us downwards. We need to be worried about our conduct, our character, our actions and our habits, and let God establish and determine our steps. Because we can't expect to accomplish an upward dream, a grandiose vision that's bigger than your life, with habits that direct our personal and work life downwards. 1 Peter 5:6-7 says this, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you at the proper time." God exalts in God's timing. I know we get frustrated at this a lot. I definitely, come on God, catch up with me, like we think that we're ahead of God somehow. But God exalts at his timing. And Joseph is put back in prison. But his conduct and his character keep rising to the top, because godly character is like a cork. You can push it beneath the water, but it's always going to pop back to the top. That's what godly character does. And in prison, a cupbearer is sent there the king sends him there, and Joseph interprets his dream. And the dream is accurate and comes to fruition. Now, I'm really impressed that Joseph interprets this dream. Not because it was correct. That's a gift from God. That was going to happen. But I'm impressed that he went out on a limb again, because last time he stood up for God, last time he used his gift, he got chucked in a pit. And Joseph didn't let the disappointments of his past dictate the choices of his future, because fear is a dream killer. Fear, any decision made of fear, will inhibit the dreams of God for your life. But the Bible says we haven't been given a spirit of fear. We don't make decisions from a place of fear, that we make decisions from a place of power, a place of love, and a place of sound mind, not from a place of emotional instability. And so Joseph steps out in boldness, where many people would have been like, no, last time that hurt, I'm not doing that again. But Joseph steps out and says, no, yes, even if God. Even if this is going to cost me something again, I'm going to use my gift for you. And he steps out and he gives this interpretation. The cupbearer says, I'll remember this. I'll remember you. And the cupbearer gets reinstated to his position, but he doesn't remember him. So Joseph feels once again that using his gift has put him in a place where God's dream can't elevate him into his future. But finally, 2 years later, Pharaoh has this dream, and none of the magicians can do it. They can't figure it out. And the cupbearer is like, oh, whoopsie. Yeah, I met this dude 2 years ago. He could have solved this problem for you. And Joseph gets pulled out of prison and put in front of Pharaoh and interprets his dream accurately. And this may seem like a champion moment, awesome moment, easy moment. Finally, opportunity's here. Finally, my dream has arrived. But opportunity can sometimes cause as much of an internal battle in us as hardship, because every time something's gone good for Joseph, there's been a big fall after it. And so good doesn't seem good when you're thinking there's a bad after it. Love may feel kind of funny to you if you're used to abuse, or stepping into that promotion might be scary when last time you're under responsibility, you caved and you failed. And so Joseph steps out again. This is another moment of bravery, that so many times opportunities can be presented to us, but will you make the decision that's based on faith, or will you act in fear? And these may not even be life-altering decisions. This may be someone on the side of the road that God's asking you to help. Maybe someone in your, where you get your hair cut. It may be a barista. It may be these little decisions that God's saying, will you use your gift here again? Or will you base it on the fear of that disappointment from the past? And Joseph presents a 100-step plan. Here's how you beat the famine. You need to do this, 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 and this. And Pharaoh says in Genesis 41, verse 37, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And he said to them, can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's spirit in him? And so Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you. You will be over my house. And all the people will obey your commands. Only I, as king, will be greater for you. In one moment, he goes from the prison to the palace. He goes from a prisoner to being a prince. Because it doesn't matter your predicament. It doesn't matter your circumstance. If you've been built up and your character's right, in one moment with God is all it takes to change everything. And Joseph makes the right decision based on his character and steps into this role where he brings a freedom around all the people of Egypt. And if you feel like you can relate to Joseph's story with the hills and the valleys, that your life has been up and down and up and down, we have to remember that all this, Joseph didn't have a life of complete and utter disaster. This happened from when he was 17 to 30. There was a building phase, but at 30, God broke the cycle. Our God is a God who breaks cycles of dysfunction. He breaks cycles of disappointment. He breaks cycles of failure when you have been built into it. So if you've been on a roller coaster, take hope, because God's probably built you into something in regards for a moment of greatness. And in that moment, like David, that opportunity comes, you can be like, I've had so many failures before. Can I even believe for that again? That word that's been spoken of in my life, maybe it is dead like everybody said, but Joseph clings to it. And the word comes to pass because no one else's actions, no one else's sins can stop the plans and dreams of God for your life. God is the only one who can really make purpose of hardship. Without him, there is no purpose to your hardship. And finally, the famine hits, but Joseph has ensured the country's going to be okay. His brothers come to Egypt because they hear that there's someone there, someone with enough wisdom, with enough foresight to gather enough food. And so Joseph's family comes to Egypt and they bow down before him because they don't recognize him. And after a bit of dramatic charades, Joseph reveals himself to them and they are petrified, as you would be. They chucked him in a pit and left him for dead. This guy has the second most power in Egypt. He could have had them executed and no one would have blinked an eye. But he doesn't. He says, actually, bring the whole family. We're going to move into Egypt. And Joseph's father on his deathbed says this in Genesis 50. He says, say this to Joseph, please forgive your brother's transgression and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of God, of your father. Joseph wept when their message came to him. His brothers also came to him, bowed down before him, and said, we are your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. And these couple verses here, these 2 or 3 verses here, you could do a whole message on these 3. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me. God planned it for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. And Joseph demonstrates one of the keys to progressing through hardship into your future. Forgiveness. And not just a forgiveness that absolves you and keeps you at a distance. Joseph manages to keep the balance of getting rid of bitterness, but keeping love. Because if it's just a forgiveness without love, it's kind of an impersonal pardon that says, yeah, okay, I've forgiven, but I want you at a distance still. But forgiveness in love always builds a bridge to reconciliation. And I'm not saying if you're in a relationship of hurt or abuse, you need to go back there and build that bridge back. But when you look at how Joseph forgave, and we look at how Jesus forgave, that Jesus came to earth, regardless of whether you cared, regardless of whether you believed, and forgave, not for the purpose that he himself could be free. Oh, I'm good, I feel better about myself. For the purpose of bridging a relationship with you. And there is truth to the statement to say that forgiving someone else is not about them. That they, even if they don't deserve it, you should forgive them. Yes, that's what we need to do as Christians. But the full picture is that we need to keep love around forgiveness as well. That Joseph didn't just forgive and absolve himself of and find freedom in his estrangement from his family. No, his forgiveness actually built a bridge back together. That forgiveness cannot be done without love. And finally, Joseph says this famous biblical phrase, you planned evil against me, God planned it for good. God's got a plan for your life. He's got a plan for your hardship. He's got a plan for your valleys. He's got a plan for your hills. And you know what, for Joseph, it would have been so much easier if he knew the plan. If God just told him in the pit, this is why you're going through it, I'm sure Joseph would have been able to endure easily. But you know what? God didn't tell Joseph. Nor did he tell Job, nor did he tell Abraham, nor did he tell Paul. And I know, you know what? He's not going to tell you. Why? Because if the reward of your suffering is something that you can see, you will only endure as long as that reward stays whole. The reward of these people needed to be the Lord. Your reward needs to be something eternal. Because if your reward is something temporary, then the waves of life are going to remove your reward and then put a new one in and take that out, and your endurance will only last as long as your reward. Your reward needs to be the Lord. That is the only way that you can make sense of hardship. That is the only way that you'll be able to endure with Christian character, with Christian conduct, is if He is your reward. And how can we see Him as our reward? Because Jesus, when He was on earth, it says He was the only person that could see His future and the plan. In fact, He asked God to take it away from Him because it was so bad. It was horrific and brutal, and He was nailed to a cross. But it said He endured the cross because of the joy that was set before Him, because of the reward that He could see. What was His reward? His reward wasn't the Lord. Because before that, He was with God in heaven. He had that. He didn't need to give that up. That wasn't His reward. He said, I'm coming down to earth for something that is of greater value to me. And He comes down to earth and He says, I will endure all this hardship for your sin, for your mistakes, for your shame. He took it. What was His reward? His reward was a personal and intimate relationship with you. Not people, you, individual you. And as we see ourselves as His reward, that's such an amazing concept, that you personally, individually, you are the reward of Jesus Christ. He went through everything because you are His reward, a relationship with you. Like Pastor Shannon said, He's not a distant God. He's a God that inhabits hearts. He's a God that wants to know you personally. And because as we get on and we start to see ourselves as His reward, we'll start to see Him as our reward.